Good day, everyone. Welcome to Finding Faith Fridays. I'm so excited for this day. You know, it's always interesting when you decide to embark on a new season and a new chapter. And with everything going on in the world today, I was like, talk to the team. And I thought, we're doing all these things for work and business. I'm like, we just need like a timeout on a Friday. So we are going to get started in about 1 minute. We'll wait for people that are here to come into the room. We will be recording this, of course, as well. So hopefully you will get the replay when that comes as well. So we will wait a minute or two, and then we are going to get started on Finding Faith Fridays. You know, I never grew up in a faith community, so this is going to be a really interesting journey for me. And coming into all of this is just to find a way that we can find common ground. So the concept around finding faith came from this idea that lots of people have different faith perspectives. And certainly if we looked in the world today, we would see that there is a division amongst all of the different faith perspectives. So through this masterclass that we will be hosting on every single Friday, I'm hoping that you will feel inspired, that you will find your definition of faith. We will have a different topic every single week going forward. And it's mostly, again, so that no matter what perspective you're coming from, that within yourself is a soul. And within yourself, there is a map. And within yourself, there's a path. So this entire series and perspective is to bring you closer to that. So I'm going to pull up our slide deck. I'm going to try to stay focused on the slide deck, and hopefully you can see me. We will pop in and out of that. So welcome to Finding Faith Fridays. I'm Janice Taylor. I will be your host for this event every single Friday. I'm also the founder of AHA Healing. Like many of you, I've been on a journey of understanding and discovery. I am Canadian, so I will full transparency say that. So hopefully we have other Canadians that will be joining us today. And we work primarily out of America and the United States. AHA Healing is my company. And when I was a kid in the 80s, they gave us a cable channel. It was to try it out in our neighborhood. It was like 1981, 82. And for whatever reason, in the middle of Canada, they decided to give us WDIB Detroit. I will never forget the day. It was like, oh, we've got cable. And now that we've got cable, it could open up to the entire world. But there were three things on WDIB Detroit at the time. One was Oprah Winfrey. The second was Carmen Harlan. And the third was Detroit Tigers baseball. I completely fell in love with the game of baseball. Alan Trammell, if you're watching this, he was one of my favorites. And I thought I could really play this game. The other thing that I was thinking at the time, I was quite fascinated by the math. And I'm young, I'm like 8, 9, 10 years old. And I'm like, why the 3 bases? Why the 3 strikes? This whole component of the math in baseball, I found fascinating. And when Oprah would come onto the TV, she would say, have your aha moment. Now, at the time, I thought she said ahava. Now, we didn't have Google, and, you had to go to the library to get a dictionary and to really understand what that word was. But that's what I thought initially that Oprah said, have your ahava moment. As I listened, and you have this old TV, so you're hammering the side because it's rolling. I discovered that she was saying, have an aha moment. And I thought, great. Well, what is the aha moment? What is the thing? Can I order it from the Sears catalog? Like, can I look for it and say, okay, I want that aha? And although she talked about it, I didn't quite get the concept of what it was. So as I fast forward through my life, and I grew up with just my mom, and my dad was an addict, and I was going through different programs as a kid. We didn't have any money, and we really didn't have much. But I had this beautiful neighborhood of kids and families from all over the world, many of them that took me in and cared for me. And because of those families, I started to see this world in a very different way. And because of that nurture and that love, when I went into high school and into doing my degree, I wanted to understand the roots of the self. And most importantly, I wanted to understand how we healed from trauma. How do we heal from emotional pain? It was a question that I had since I was a little girl. I wondered why I was seeing the things that I was seeing when I go to my dad's house, for example, and I was witnessing all of that debauchery. When I was thinking about it, I just felt a sensation that perhaps maybe there was more to this story. And that began a lifetime of study. And so when I was deciding to name the healing theory that I was writing, I decided to call it Ahava. And for the business side of it, we decided to call it AHA. So that's the roots of the original part of this story. So about me, my background in education is psychology. I spent the last 10 years, well, before that really, but the last 13 years in the tech industry. Before that, I was in the pharmaceutical industry. So I spent 10 years really understanding pharmaceutical drugs after my degree in psychology. And then I spent the last 12 to 13 years in the tech industry, understanding a new type of drug. And prior to that, I grew up on the streets, really understanding that when I was at my dad's house about the roots of addiction. So I feel like I've had like these 30-year blocks of business, education, study life. I am an honorary captain for the Royal Canadian Navy. That was something that was quite an achievement. It was an appointed position. And yes, when I decided to make my healing theory and when I decided to make my company, and when Oprah was on the TV, she was, of course, the first person I wanted to write. So I wrote Oprah a letter. I said, this is what I'm going to do with my life. I quit my job to go into the tech industry because I was concerned about children. And lo and behold, before you know it, I got a phone call and I found my way on my way to Chicago to meet Oprah Winfrey for her final year on air. And then that's some of those pictures from that event. I've been working across sports, music, and entertainment, but always on the side writing this theory. And last year, it's time to hang up my tech roots and to dive completely into healing, answering that proverbial question of how do we heal? So as we come into this masterclass today on finding faith, I don't think I need to tell you that much of the world is hurting. It doesn't take much if we go and look at anything going on online. If you are someone who has children, you know that they're hurting. The world has just been kind of turned upside down. We have wars happening for various different reasons. We have political institutions that we used to trust and now we don't. We have medical institutions we used to trust and now we don't. Every sort of major pillar of our lives that used to ground all of us, we now question. We question church. We question everything. I never grew up in the faith community. When I was a kid and my dad left when I was 6, my mother said that the God she knew wouldn't give her the life she had. And that was the end of it. There was no mention of God again. There was no mention of prayer. I had friends that mothers went to church, but I still didn't really grow up in any kind of a faith community. But I believe that we have a silent suffering epidemic because we've lost connection with the self. We've lost connection with who we really are. And so if you look at these numbers, they're probably more. You know, we say 1 in 4, but I'd say it's probably 1 in 2, where we just feel this extraordinary weight. And there's different reasons for that happening. But we here on Finding Faith Fridays want to talk about how we've disconnected from the soul. So let's talk about the wound. When you were a child, maybe wherever you've been in your life, there's probably memories that you have. Perhaps your parents were divorced or somebody was an alcoholic or abusive. Maybe your parents stayed together and you didn't have anything of this lightning bolt of this aha wound. I wanted to understand the roots of our woundedness. And in particular, how does the wound show up in our life over and over and over again? And so I'm just going to take this off for a second and hopefully you can see me. When we think about our woundedness, one of the hardest things for most of us to come and accept or even to be gentle with is what happens when that wound transpires. What happens inside of our beings? So if you think that you come into this world, you are full and you are complete at your birth, if we look at the different theories, many would say that babies actually come into the world relational. They come into the world ready to be loved. But most importantly, they come into the world with the expectation that they're going to be loved. You can look at child psychology, you can look at all different pieces of science. And it's now proven that babies are relational. They're seeking relationship. And that's what they come to expect. But something happens between their birth and their 10th birthday. So why do we talk about those 10 years? If you even look at our decades, look at how the economy is built. Everything really happens in these cycles of 10 years. There's different numbers for it. You can look in biblical times. There's lots of data around the decade is so important. But decades are repetitive cycles as well. So if you take your first 10 years and then you take your second 10 years and you take your next 10 years, you'll notice that there is a pattern. But if you trace all of that back, it all traces back to a crack in the manifold, back into the wound. Now, if you think about this, I'm going to just turn that slide back on. When that crack happens, what happens inside of us? Now, for many of you, you may not have an actual memory of your crack, of your wound. Gabor Mate would say your psychic break. Many people don't even have a memory. They just know that something happened. Some people have the burden of knowing exactly what happened. Some just go, well, nothing happened. I don't know. I think I'm perfectly fine. But I believe the wound is purposeful. I believe, after all of these years of study, that the wound can tell us everything. And in our world of aha healing, we call this the big P. The big P is your big pain point. And so if you think about this, and you can go into Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Now imagine you have this wound, kind of a dart got placed in there. We call this the thorn. The thorn gets placed in your being sometime between your birth and 10th birthday. Some people say it's even earlier, but we give a little bit of latitude and say that between your birth and your 10th birthday, the wound came in and a thorn gets stuck there. Now, if you're familiar with psychology, there is something called Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's in common vernacular. Most people, even if they're not from psychology, have heard about it. It's a pyramid. We're going to discuss Maslow's hierarchy of needs today. But when that thorn enters, it most often enters between your basic needs and love and belonging. Love and belonging is where the thorn gets stuck in that wound, and then it festers. If you've ever had a sliver in your finger and you don't prick it out, it just stays there. It's kind of irritating, and it can sometimes infect, but if it really stays, it can really become a problem. So think about your crack more like a sliver. It's like a crack in the manifold that allowed all of this system to be turned on. And when the system turned on, we decided to change who we really are. So once we have our wound and then we have our thorn, then we have all this emotional pain. And after our 10th birthday, we go out into the world little by little, more and more. You become teenagers and you build friends, and then you get into your 20s and you go into college, and perhaps you meet your future spouse or partner. Then you have children, and all of that original wound from the thorn establishes itself as this pain. Now, most of us live in our conscious brain. Certainly, if you're spending any time on digital, you will be in your conscious brain. And all below the surface is this emotional pain. This emotional pain is all below the surface, and it gets pushed back into your subconscious. Now, when you're conscious, you think, oh, I'm in charge of my head. I've got my mind. Your stinking thinking is good to go. But when you are emotional, this is the most important thing to understand. When you are emotional, it activates all that pain below the surface. So you're looking at someone that's in front of you right now, and it's like, you deserve this. Here's my onslaught of my pain. You get to feel this way. But what we really start to come to understand in this process, because it's a system, from the wound to the thorn to the pain, it's a system, is that it's actually old emotional pain that's bursting out of your body. And it's spraying on everybody in front of you. And because it's in the subconscious, we don't even know why we feel the way we do most of the time. We try to give this feeling a present story in our present moment, but really it's old pain. And at AHA Healing, we talk about this all the time. It's old pain. So this is the wonderful system of AHA Healing. I wrote this and created this because I wanted to get to the roots of understanding it. So I studied 12 different academic theories, 30 different therapeutic processes, combined with a whole bunch of other books and thought leaders over the last 30 years. I am on my way to begin my Harvard education after delaying it for the last 20 years, come January, to write this thesis. And so this is really how most humans operate. And why you need to understand how most humans operate is because you have two competing voices at all times, in every minute, including this one, of every day. You have the voice of the ego and you have the voice of the soul. The voice of the ego wants you to be in the dark, wants you to live in fear, and it is everything external to you. So everything that your conscious brain sees outside of yourself is the ego. And as a child, you came into this world ready to be loved. That wound happened, your big P that you see up in this corner here, that big P happened. And then the ego is like, oh, I've got you. And it's like this slippery little effing sucker that slips into your life and starts to whisper in your ear that you are not worthy of love. This can happen to a child sometimes before even they can talk or walk. That ego's like, see, told ya, you should be afraid. They're all trying to hurt you. Don't trust them. Get them. Look at this outside of myself. And you get into this system of emotional pain. And it's so important to understand that emotional pain and that woundedness created a system of how you respond and behave emotionally to your world. That system is in charge of everything that is coming to you. And I know that that's hard to understand because the second part of this system that's the most important is your codependent triangle. At AHA Healing and every Friday, we do not stop talking about the codependent triangle. It is human addiction. And people think, oh no, codependency is just people pleasing. And it's only because you had a father or mother that was an alcoholic, for example. No, codependency happens from our woundedness. And the moment that the wound and the thorn and the pain came in, we changed how we were with everyone around us to fit the system. So if they saw mom was, sad all the time, maybe she was a victim, dad's the perpetrator, you maybe become a martyr. And a martyr in the M in the triangulation, they show up people pleasing, but you could also show up as a victim yourself, or you can also be a perpetrator. There's usually 3 dominant roles. That is what humans are addicted to. It's the most insidious sucker that keeps us socked in to our ego thinking. The third thing that happens, and the 3 happen simultaneously. You had your wound, you got your thorn, you got your pain, and then a system kept you in the dark of your life. It kept you disconnected from your soul, even though the soul was there, imploring you, dragging you, saying, hey, I'm still here. Your life has a calling. You should be here. But it keeps pulling you back into the darkness, and the soul is still trying to get your attention. And the soul has its system in order to heal. But then something happens. We start to feel the soul more. We start to hear this voice coming in, and this voice is calling us. We're like, what is that? Where should I go? So people start to take the walk towards the soul, and then they get stuck on the proverbial bridge. You have one foot in the dark and 1 foot in the light. You can't stay, but you don't know how to go. You can't still do the same shit, expecting a different result, the same cycle of emotional pain, all of that. But you also know that you have a soul and a purpose, but you don't know how to get there. So you start to feel the crushing weight of this. You start to feel like you're split in half. And if you've ever read Richard Rohr's wonderful book called Falling Upward, where he talks about the first half of life and the second half of life, this model was loosely based on that. And then I took the hero's journey and said, well, could that be a really good cadence? And so this is what I discovered. Most people are on the bridge. And I thought, well, I should just get to my soul. I'll just dive right there. You can't get to the soul if you don't address the wound. And the wound has a thorn in it. And we got to pluck out the thorn so that the root can lie back down, and then you can walk around the light side of the moon. But not until you open your big P box. So you have to climb up the flagpole, look back ever so slightly, collect all this gorgeous data so that you can then walk around the light side of the moon. This is the system of emotional pain. And in our society today, more than any other time in history, because the invention of social media, which I'm going to talk about technology and how it's actually built for human addiction. We get addicted to the devices, but it's really the silent addiction, the most debilitating addiction, apart from anything else in the world, is this codependent addiction. And I call it addiction because it operates in very much the same way. But instead of ingesting a drug, we ingest human behavior, reactions, and responses. And this is often the 3 poles of this is where you will be. So this is an example. Martyrs. Everyone probably knows the martyr. They usually believe that they're right, and they often kind of are the dominant post on there, and they are always fixing. They're the ones that are throwing themselves on the stake, so to be, I will forget about my own needs because I got everybody else's needs to care for. And we think they're good people. They define themselves based on doing things for everyone else while denying their own feelings, their own voice, and their own desires. They sacrifice their own personal faculty in order to do that. Victims. Victims often show up in the world believing that everything happens to them, that they ultimately have no choice. This part of the addiction, when people show up as victims, they often don't think that the world is really cut out for them. They can self-sabotage, and we see a lot of empath creatives who feel a lot can often become victims. Perpetrators always gets a bad rap because even the name sounds like tough, but they're more solo-driven people. They like to sort of go in, bust things up, and then they leave, and they say, I don't know why you guys are upset. I'm just telling the truth. They often start sentences, well, I'm just going to be the devil's advocate. They always sort of set themselves apart. And so this all response to it is a learned human behavior that you learn from your parents, and those parents learned it from their parents. And oftentimes you're born into a codependent triangle of which you have no choice. You don't have any choice oftentimes at the time of the event. You do have a choice as you age and heal to leave this silent addiction behind because it kills you in the end. The drug ceases to work. The human addiction eventually falls down because guess what? Humans are humans. They're gonna fuck up a lot. And they're not going to be able to deliver you that love and belonging that you're looking for. Eventually, they just don't meet the demand because humans can't. Because here is the real skinny, and this is why you're here today, is that the only place that we can be full up and unconditionally loved is within the self. But when we have our pain, our thorn, our wound, our codependent addiction, that whole system, it disconnects us from faith. It disconnects us. And this is so important because when I was starting to write this theory, I went and spent a lot of time in the recovery programs. I grew up in them. I was put in some of them for addicts. I went through Alateen. I'd gone through these moments. And I spent time in the addiction community specifically because that was what I was raised in. That was the roots of my stock and ultimately became my calling. And what I discovered after taking a psychology degree and diving into the world of therapy, and again, going to give love to the therapists of the world, I always felt that there was something missing. So because I didn't grow up in a faith community, I thought I'm going to go learn about faith because maybe there's something missing here. Then I really loved philosophy and I wanted to understand some of the philosophical point of view. And if I looked across all of the academic fields, this is what I came to understand. A lot of them say a lot of the same things. And ultimately, when we're just talking about healing emotional pain and trauma, you cannot go the last quarter mile. You cannot make it to the summit without faith. There's not enough willpower in the world. There's no other skills for you to have. There's no more knowledge for you to have. There's no more barfing out your story to your therapist in the end. Ultimately, the last quarter mile is a singular journey that you take within yourself to establish your faith. Now, faith has often been associated with religion, and faith is not necessarily just religion. It is to some, and however you define it, it's important to you. But you were born with a soul. That is a human certainty. I am positive of it. If you believe you do not have a soul, they'll say, well, I'm an atheist, which is still a choice. You still have a soul. You don't have to believe in a religion or a God, but you still must understand that you have a soul. And today, I'm going to hopefully make a good argument as to those two systems live inside of yourself. Your source, your soul, and your constant reservoir of faith, if you so choose to dive into the pit of self, to dive the last quarter mile into yourself. You need to take this treasure map and get to that place so you can pluck out your thorn. But you cannot do it with much of the mechanisms that currently exist in therapy and healing. So some of them get you there closely, but ultimately this last quarter mile is really the singular journey. So when you're looking at this whole system, and we all know Brené Brown, she certainly has brought shame to the forefront of much of our lives. So much of her research was really sort of these ends of the spectrum of shame and blame, which leads to vulnerability. And the thing about shame, it actually forms in our wombs. So if you travel back again to the first 10 years of your life and you have your psychic break, you start to see things around you and perhaps things were done to you that make you feel shame. And shame ultimately separates us from faith. Because if we look at faith from a religious perspective, many of us don't believe that we're worthy of love. So if you go sit in a church, for example, and it says, well, God unconditionally loves you and you don't believe that you're lovable and you don't believe that you're worthy of love, it's hard to believe what that pastor is saying to you when you still have a wound and a pain in your body. So there's a disconnect. You can't believe in faith when someone's saying that you're unconditionally loved at your birth and all the love you have is within yourself. As long as your pain body is alive and controlling your life, it disconnects you from faith. And shame keeps you in prison. It's the shame that we believe as children that we deserved the outcome. And when I was a girl, and my dad, God bless him, he's now since passed away, he was such an addict. And I could see that when he was sober, I could see the shame in him. I was really little and I could tell this wasn't the dad he wanted to be. I could tell that all of the things that we witnessed as little girls being in the house and it was all these raging parties, I could tell that he wasn't proud of it. And I could see that shame caused him to drink more and caused him to become further of an addict, because then you're awake and you're in your thoughts and in your head and you have this crumbling sensation of like, oh my God. And so shame really is the first feeling that we have that associates to shame that isn't ours, to pain that isn't ours. We as children didn't have a choice. We as adults do. As children, we didn't have a choice to what happened to us. We didn't choose our parents. We didn't choose their parents. We didn't choose our name, most likely. We didn't choose our first grade teacher. We didn't choose our eye color, our hair color. There was about 1,000, tens of thousands different data points that all happened before our 10th birthday that we never picked. We didn't choose them. So if we didn't choose them, why are we shaming ourselves with them? And if it's the shame of someone else's pain, can we find a way to see that they also, at the time, they didn't have a choice either. But if they're adult, they do. And then you have an individual responsibility to go and handle the pain that is left inside of you, even if you didn't give it to yourself, even if it was brought to you by someone else. At some point, we have to take the journey inward with just ourselves, because the counter, the twisted sister to shame is blame. And that's what keeps us from connecting to faith. Because as long as we have shame, when then we turn around and we blame everyone for the shame that we have, and then we repeat the cycle and into our codependency, back into our emotional pain, back into where the thorn lives, back into the original wound. So you see, it's just this cascade. And we keep doing this over and over and over again, sometimes several times a day. We live in this pain. And it doesn't take much now in our life to look for all the reasons for us to be disconnected from faith, from us to be disconnected from our soul. It doesn't take much for the ego to show you why the world's going to hell in a handbag. Because if we really looked at it, it doesn't take us long to see all the places that we are not loved. And that is the crisis of our times. The crisis of our times is we keep looking outside of ourselves, trying to find the answers, the latest guru that has the answer, the latest person that has the answer. It's all just a big, giant fucking ball of bullshit. The final mile for you to heal is for you to take that journey inward, to pluck out the thorn so that you can heal, so you can say goodbye to shame, so that you can mourn that you've taken the shame on that was never your shame to take on. And it impacted your life and your decision-making as an adult. So here at AHA Healing, I started to have this wonderful, wild imagination. And I started to think, well, if we have pain, what's the purpose of it? What is the damn purpose? And when I was a little girl seeing all the things that I was seeing, it wasn't something that kids should ever see. And I thought, well, I'm not that bad. Like, certainly I shouldn't be seeing all of this. Certainly I shouldn't be experiencing this. I started to wonder, like, why am I seeing this shit? Why am I watching all of this? Why am I having my first drink at 8? Why am I smoking cigarettes by the time I'm 10? Why am I experiencing this? And I did go to this state of like my victimhood, feeling like this isn't fair. And when I went through my mourning and my rage and my anger and my bargaining and all the stages of grief, I thought there has to be a reason for this pain. And it's not just for a medical diagnosis. It's not so the psychologist can say that I have general anxiety disorder. It's not so that when I go to the addiction communities and I can say once an addict, always an addict. There needed to be a better explanation for emotional pain. That we weren't just someone with an addictive disease, that we just weren't that was not the sum of who we are. I was told I was an addict by the time I was 13 years old. I was in an aftercare program when I was 15. And we had to start and say, hi, my name is Janice and I'm an addict. We had to say that, whether you're a drug addict or an alcoholic. It was an aftercare program at school. And I was saying it and I went to the washroom, and one of the girls and the other participants in the addiction group were teenagers. And this is in the 90s. She said to me, she goes, do you really think you belong here? And I'm like, well, I've been drinking since I was 8. Like, yeah, I'd say I belong here. And she's like, but do you really believe that you belong here? And I had a well-intentioned guidance counselor who was saying, you have an 85% chance of becoming an addict. And I was like, wow, that's kind of a death sentence in my mind. And he goes, once an addict, always an addict. And once you're an addict, there's just no looking back. Like, you're going to just have to fight that demon your whole life. I was like, geez, Louise, there's got to be something more to this. And it was pressed on me and pressed on me and pressed on me that this was my fate, because of the actions of my father, this was my fate, that I was fated to become an addict just like him. Now, we had no money, there was no food, that place was chaotic, it was like a squatter house. I was like, oh, so I'm supposed to be cheerful now, and this is supposed to be what in my life? It was a death sentence. The conditions and the symptoms of my emotional pain was diagnosed as a death sentence to me. And I didn't buy it. And I thought, well, if I don't buy it, then I've got to go get to the roots and understanding it. So I wrote this theory. So ahava is the Hebrew word, by the way, to give love. I only discovered that 20 years later after I heard it in my ear and was pretty sure Oprah was studying it. I wanted to look across all the theories. I just felt that we've been so myopic, so linear, so siloed in our thinking and understanding about faith, trauma, and pain, that we needed to look across a broad-based knowledge of theories, that we needed to look at psychology and religious studies and philosophy, and what does neuroscience teach us, and what does biology teach us, and what do we know of even about building in the startups after living in Silicon Valley and building tech companies. I was like, okay, well, there's all these different pieces. And if I take a little bit of each of them and I mush it all together, could I see the human differently? And the answer is unequivocally yes. Yes, yes, yes. And the theory of ahava is saying, well, if each human being is uniquely created, then we can actually start to see that there's this thread that makes you uniquely you. And if you are uniquely you, what is your pain telling you about you? The last quarter mile after studying all of this information, looking at the 4 quadrants of the self, mental, we spend a lot of time. Physical, we try to exercise our bodies and understand what's going. Emotional, we do almost daily squat, hence why we're here, around our that. And now we are in the spiritual part of our life. And some people just try to go to spirit without addressing the emotional. And some people try to live in the physical and the mental without addressing the spiritual and the emotional. And so if you think about you as a human being, you are 4 quadrants. You are 4 distinct quadrants. But at the same time, your recipe could be a combination of a few different things. The pathway and your map and your GPS could be different. If you saw a cognitive behavioral psychologist, for example, they would have one opinion, but a humanist would have another. And perhaps humanistic psychology would be better for you. And so if you think about that, I thought, what if we put this together and we were to actually make a theory? So because you are here on the very first Finding Faith Friday, we are going to talk about step 1, which is the calling. So this first day, the next Friday is going to be refusal. This first day is the calling. I wrote this theory and I wanted to reinvent the 12 steps. I learned the 12 steps, I was about 8, 9 years old. And I thought, well, some of these 12 steps of AA are okay, but I think we're missing some really important ones. And then I learned about Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey. And I thought, okay, I can get behind that. Shit, if Star Wars is made by that, then obviously I could learn that. And the first step of ahava is the calling. And it's built over 3 phases, and we wrote 12 new steps. So welcome today to the calling. So now that I've given you the backstory and the history and the making of this, and going back to the principles of what's happening in the woundedness, why the thorn exists, I want you to know that 99.9% of the world is still living in some form of their emotional pain. And everyone has a big P. Everyone does. And as I mentioned, I wanted to understand what to do with my big P. What do I do with this pain? Certainly, it needs to mean something else. So the calling. So if you think about your life, so I'd like you right now just to take a minute, and I want you just to travel back to the first 10 years of your life and see if you have an initial memory. And whatever your date of birth is, doesn't matter. What is the first memory that pops in your head? Is it your first day of kindergarten? Day you fell down off your bike? Is it the day your parents divorced? Maybe it's the first day that something totally awful happened to you. And if you think about that moment in time, it's the moment in time, even if you don't fully remember it, because there's a way that we can find it out without that. It set all of this in motion. But if you think about emotional pain and how it relates to your calling, and we look at it from a psychological point of view, in the last 20 to 30 years, probably, really, if you look at the establishment of like post Maslow, post Abraham Maslow, and we look at transpersonal psychology or integral psychology or spiritual psychology, there's an evolution. But if you look at the history of psychology, you look at Freud, many people are familiar with the psychoanalysis, but there was actually Carl Jung that was even more interesting in that case that I thought, because he started to talk about the archetypes of self. And the thing that I loved about Carl Jung towards the end of his life, Carl Jung mentioned the fact that there was this all-knowing being. So here is a profound psychoanalysis. He's looking at the different parts of our human beings. He's looking at what our unconscious, subconscious doing in our lives. And he's saying it's collecting memories. It's actually like a data recorder. And you're going to continue to live in your life from your conscious brain, but your subconscious, you need to think about that as that it's always recording. It's recording all of the events of your life, all of the moments, and stacking them up and putting this extraordinarily interesting, intricate formula together just for you. Because no one has your data. No one has your specific data. We may have parts that are similar, but for the most part, no one has exactly your view of the world with your parents. Nobody has the exact view of the world that you had with your grandparents, the house you lived in, the hair you have, the eye color, your fingertips, your fingernails, everything about you was uniquely put together for you. Carl Jung talked about it. And if you think about Abraham Maslow and the hierarchy of needs, he talked about the self-transcendence and onto the self-discovery and self-mastery and onto self-transcendence. Now, the self-actualization piece of that is just above love and belonging. So this is where I started to think, okay, so if you get a wound and the thorn comes in at love and belonging, does it block you from discovering what your actual calling is? Like if you can't get to the top of the pyramid, which is self-actualization and transcendence, then I must be stuck somewhere in limbo land between my calling and this thorn. But why is the thorn placed there? And if I pluck out the thorn, is there this eruption of other data that I don't even know I have because the pain was so intense that I wanted to bury it into the bottom of myself and throw away the key and never think about it again? And that's what our response is to emotional pain. 80% of all the empirical research on the calling has just been published since 2011. Now think about that. What a rapid amount of empirical research that is all suggesting that you as a human being, from a psychology perspective, yes, you in fact have a calling. Some people define it differently. Some people define a calling different. But the first step on this journey of healing is for you to believe that you have one. And it's yours. We can't tell you what that is, although we can look at your data and information and help you point into the direction. As you dive inward to do this individual internal work to connect to your soul in faith, your soul is your recorder. The soul is going to tell you what it is. If anybody's going to tell you what it is, you need to not listen to them. You need to discover what it is. Here at AHA Healing, we try to show you where there's a window. We try to show you the map. We try to go through that process with you so that you can get there. But the last quarter mile, it's you, and your faith. That's it. You want to know your calling? You got to get to that last quarter mile. There's a map for that. There's a process for that. There's a step for that. But you got to get to that bottom piece of that. So here is Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This is you in your infant life, your physiology, your safety, your security. Right about here, friendship, family, and your sense of connection, that's where the thorn comes in. Now, I want to talk about digital just for a minute here, because when I was living in Silicon Valley, I was like, okay, so this is the Mecca. It was 2009. My babies were little. I'm living in Saskatchewan. I'm walking the girls, my youngest to school. My other was just 2 years old. And I noticed that everyone's so excited and animated because they've got this thing called Facebook. And I was like, what is it? And my friend at the time, she's like, oh, you got to go check it out. It's like everyone from high school is on Facebook. And I was like, okay, so like, but what are we doing there? She's like, well, we're just all connecting again. And it feels so electric to connect again. I opened up Facebook in 2009 and I had a shiver down my spine. And I was like, great, he's a dealer. Now, I've been around the drugs, alcohol community a lot. I know a dealer when I see one. You don't know you're taking this drug, but they're taking the money and you're still showing up. And I'm like, great, this is a dealer. The thing that I knew that they were selling was a connection between love and belonging. And I knew that it was false. I fundamentally knew that it was going to sell us this bill of goods, that we're all connecting and we're connecting in this world. And I knew that the thorn was living in love and belonging. And I knew if we entered these spaces that at first it would feel great, because isn't it always great the first time you take some drugs or alcohol? Isn't it always great? Until you're taking it so often that you don't even know who you are anymore. And you've taken and ingested so much garbage and you're so disconnected from yourself that you now just go there and angry. And then someone's going to sell you another bill of goods and another bill of goods. And before you know it, you're so far from who you used to be. And it's not just Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg, although he is the OG of, I believe, tech addiction to another level. But it's the thorn. And when we're seeking love and belonging outside of ourselves, we are susceptible to our ego and to human addiction. The love and belonging is an inside job. It's an inside job. If you are past the age of 10 years old and you are on your way to be an adult, it's an inside job for you to do the work to heal. And if you can pluck up that thorn, then you can climb to the top of the mountain. So that was this whole epiphany. So as I was having this epiphany in 2009, going, wow, so tech addiction and technology, wow, this is really the new drug cartel. I knew it was the new drug cartel. I moved to Silicon Valley and I was in Facebook and I'm in the campus. And so part of going to the Oprah show after launching my tech company was that basically out of Canada, they were like, oh, you know, you're the future of technology. And I was like, yeah, I'm going to go to Silicon Valley. I go to Silicon Valley. I go to Facebook. We go to Apple. We go to Google. As Canadians, our Canadian government put together basically a contingency of us to go there and learn. And I'm sitting there and everyone's like, isn't this amazing? And we can like get kids really, really young. And I was like, whoa, whoa. I go, you know, you can't put kids in these spaces yet because their social and emotional learning isn't developed yet. And if you're going to put kids into these digital spaces, it's going to fuck them up. And I go, you can't do that yet. And I was so outraged as a mother. I got escorted out of the building. Granted, I was kicking and screaming and not happy because I thought, this is not at all the plan. And as I was learning about this, I decided to move back to Canada and I moved to British Columbia. And I thought, I got to understand this faith component. I think I really understand this psychology. I understand codependency. I'm understanding addiction. I thought, but I have no faith background whatsoever. So I decided to do my church walk. So I moved to British Columbia from Silicon Valley in 2012. And I'm here in British Columbia. And where I live happens to be the mecca of lots of churches. And I'm going to tour a whole bunch. And as I'm living here, I decided to go home back to Saskatchewan to a party. And I'm at a party and this lady walks over to me and she says, you know, it's so good to meet a Jew in Saskatchewan. I never meet a Jews in Saskatchewan. I'm like, oh, I'm not Jewish. And she goes, oh, yes, you are. I'm like, no, pretty sure I'm not. You know, I do remember my mom saying that she was raised Anglican and not going to be that way. Little did I know that I did find out that my grandmother's mother was in fact Jewish. And when they immigrated to Canada into Milestone, Saskatchewan, they raised everyone Christian. So I never knew anything about that. I was pretty stunned. So I thought, okay, well, if that's the truth, I'm going to take a church walk. I met a rabbi. I wanted to read everything I could from the Christian faith. And this really stood out to me as something that I found quite fascinating on the calling. It says, we are made in the image of God. And I was like, well, what does that mean? And I'm sure that there's lots of people that have way more faith than I do and way more understanding around this topic than I do. I just felt that was very comforting. And if there was this soul that was living inside of us, and according to Carl Jung, it's connected to something bigger than us. And if it's connected to, whether you define it the universe or however, some people say God is a man in the sky. Other people say it's not. Whatever your definition, I want to be very clear. It's important to not have a semantic debate about this, because the semantic debate is a nightmare. The semantic debate of the logic of the world is in our ego. I prefer not to live there. I prefer to believe that if I am made in the image of God, that this soul and this superpower that I genuinely have born to me based on all of the evidence, that I can connect to it. And if babies are relational from their first breath, knowing that they're here to be loved, is the first relationship they have before they learn to speak, is the one that they have inside with the soul. That when we talk about having a relationship with God, does it perhaps have to be something similar to that? And if that's the case, then hell yeah, I'd say that all of us are made in the image of God. If you string together all of the facts from the different disciplines, it becomes very hard to not understand that we are in fact born with our soul. So this brings me to Star Wars. Star Wars. Now, I saw this movie way later than everybody else in the world did, but here is the story. Joseph Campbell was a philosopher, and he basically looked at all the different philosophies to establish the commonality amongst all of them. So I quite like that, because I like to look at all the different theories and then establish the commonality. And I thought, wow, this is really interesting. Star Wars. Joseph Campbell put together something called the hero's journey. And essentially, he's saying that every human being has a calling, and that calling is yours, born specifically to you. And you spend the rest of your life establishing relationships, perfecting it, and getting to it so that you can ultimately serve humanity in some way. And so I took the hero's journey and loosely based that onto Ahava. And what was interesting when I was reading about the story of Joseph Campbell, he actually became friends with George Lucas. And George Lucas, as you know, is the founder of Star Wars. And he said, well, you should really take this hero's journey and make a movie. And I thought that was really neat. So here's this movie that most people are diehard fans of. And we have Luke, and we have all these different stories that have these story arcs of the different hero's journey within that. I like to talk about the Karate Kid, and the Karate Kid meets the Miyagi, and the Miyagi needs to take him here. And then he ends up being this wonderful human being. And I thought, well, what if every single human being is born with a calling, like Karate Kid, like Star Wars, and we needed to go on this path, and we needed to meet the Miyagi, and we needed to continue to do that. So when he looked at all of the different philosophies, that's what essentially Joseph Campbell was saying, is that every person born has a calling. And I thought, what a beautiful, beautiful thing. When we don't know our calling, and when we have not healed, we play these roles. We don't play the hero of our journey and our story yet. We play a victim, a murderer, or a martyr, or a perpetrator. We play those roles because that's the cycle of emotional pain. But if you flip that over to your golden triangle and become the hero of your story and know your calling, you leave these pain stories behind. You leave these behaviors behind, and you ultimately can embrace your calling. So this is what I concluded after all of this, is that every human being is essentially a AA battery. Seems simplistic, I know, but it's true. And hear me out. If you've ever tried to put the battery into the right spot or the wrong spot of a radio or a remote control, and you're like, oh, it's still not working. And everybody will say to you, well, do you have the battery in the right way? I know you've said it, I've said it. But if you look at the battery, it's got a positive end and a negative end, and it has two charges that are happening at the same time. So then as a kid, and lots of chaos was going on around me, I used to go out of the house at night. I climbed through the back of the field, and I go to some place called Kaplan Field. You can look it up. It's in Regina, Saskatchewan. And I'd sit on the scoreboard and I'd watch the game of baseball. And I look up at the sky and I would see these stars. And I sometimes see a shooting star. And I had this really vivid imagination. And I'd be sitting there watching the game of baseball, and I would be looking at the stars, and here I've got two hands and two legs and two eyes. And I started to think about this concept of how all of this was miraculously connected. And as I started to look at the pain point, why does my pain exist? And why do I remember it so much? And why did I bury it? And why do I want to avoid it? And why do I never want to open that box again? And why do I never want to travel to that spot again? It carries all this charge. And I thought, if it carries all this charge, doesn't it have its opposite? If it carries all its charge here and it's painful, then that exact same data point must also have a purpose point. And when you put the two together and you put it in a goddamn remote control, it works. I thought, oh my God, maybe all this pain that I have experienced has the same flip side opposite charge of my purpose. And if I could look at my pain, I could figure out my purpose. And if I could read my pain from a different perspective, I could find my purpose. And if I knew that this pain was in me and everybody had it, then everyone must have a unique purpose. And this was my ultimate aha. And as I was sitting there at the scoreboard in Kaplan Field watching a game of baseball, the man used to say, when the girl's sitting on the scoreboard, please get down. And then I tell the guy in the right field, because he gave me sunflower seeds, I said, you tell him that I am not moving and I have no money and this is the best seat in the house. And my love of baseball started me to understand the math. And there's a really beautiful book called Divine Dance by Richard Rohr. If you've not read it, I talked about, falling upward, first and second half of life. And there was this concept of the Trinity. And I thought, wow, this whole component of the Trinity is fascinating. And I then at that point figured that God had made baseball, because I was like, wow, first, second, third, home free, 3 strikes, you're out, 9 innings, a third, and a third. We have these parents, man, woman, father, mother, they're 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. Okay, what's my triangulation? If codependency robs me of faith, what's the opposite? Because we're batteries. All of this compounding feelings all came into this moment. And I went, oh my God, we are a third, and a third. I'm a third of the big P of my mom. I'm a third of the big P of my dad. And I'm a third of the big P just designed for me. But what is my mother's gift and what is my father's gift? I know how to see my dad in pain, but do I know how to see my dad in purpose? I know how to see my mom in pain. I know all the things that I wish she did differently because she hurt me as a child and I wish I knew it differently. But what was her gift? And what did God just give me? And he gave me these people and they were brought into my family. And this is who I was born to. I can't change that piece of that. But what is that data really saying? And if we need to counteract the codependent, most insidious, silent victim, human addiction of our time, then we must also understand that it's got to have a golden triangle. And for those that even believe in the Star of David, it's 2 triangles opposite of each other. What if I extracted them? Is that really the message of our life? The battle of good versus evil. These 2 triangles, these 2 pieces of that, David versus Goliath. Everything in our life has been these 2 things, the sun and the moon. And on that scoreboard at Kaplan Field in Regina, Saskatchewan, I went, oh, baseball. Some good math. You know that you're not a good baseball player until, you're really good. If you hit it over 300, there's the 3 again. And then I read The Divine Dance by Richard Rohr. And my world went, poof. And I thought, forget psychics. Forget people that say, oh, you're this, that. Yes, I'm going to give love to psychics. I know that you channel. I understand that's important. But I wanted the math. I didn't want it to be made up. I wanted it to be exactly, what is my data? What is my calling? What is my pain? And if I flipped it over, what would it say? What is the math? And this is what I want you to take home today. Everyone has a calling. And this is the data. 2.5 quintillion bytes of data are created every day in our humanity. 3 billion searches, 300 million photos. Every minute there's 510 comments. But this is the most important thing. 1.5 to 7% of our genome DNA is only human. The rest, we really don't know. Some of it could be, oh, they say Neanderthal, oh, it could be this. They really don't know the rest of what makes you you. And isn't that a wonderful mystery? So let's look at science. Forget religion if you don't believe in it then. Don't believe in the philosophical point that says you have a calling. Don't agree with Carl Jung and psychology. Don't agree. Can you agree that if you looked at your biology, that 93% of it, you have absolutely no idea what the mystery of that is? Don't you want to know? Isn't that ultimately the journey you want to take? Is there really any other journey to take than the one that lives inside of you, the mystery that is inside of you? You are given the mystery. You were born with it. It is a certainty. Why not take the journey towards that? So I get that it's hard and confusing when I say, go take the journey. They're like, yeah, great. How? I wrote the 12 steps. You can take a look at it. I am not here to tell you that this is the only way. In fact, do not make me in any regard your perfect person of having all the answers. That is not my intention today. My intention today is that you start to have hope that maybe you do have a calling and it is buried inside of you. And I'm a pretty practical girl. If you know anything about Saskatchewan and Canada, we're really from the earth. I wanted 12 steps, 3 phases. Tell me what it is. Is this what happens to us? And I discovered after all of these years of study that no one skips a step. If you really want to know and want to pluck out your thorn and heal that wound and birth your calling, there is 12 very distinct steps you must take to travel to it, to pluck it out of yourself so that the root lies back down so that you can become the ultimate tree. You may think that you're an elm tree, but you may be an evergreen. You don't know. So I have been doing this work for a long time. Here are some of the quotes of the people that have come to us to do this. It is exactly 1 o'clock, so I want to make sure that I'm ending exactly on an hour. The epiphany of all of this was discovering, taking that hero's journey, that this first phase is about discovery. And if you're going to join us on Fridays and Finding Faith Fridays, I hope that you will take the discovery of you. That the first thing you do is dive inside of this wonderful magic that lives inside of you, all of the clues. Become a super sleuth of your own life, of your own story, of your own data. You are far more interesting than any person that you may look outside of yourself. Celebrities, they're not as interesting as you are to yourself. You are the star of your own show. You are the hero. You are the star of the movie. And through all of these phases, from 1, 2, and 3, from discovery to adventure to homecoming, you can actually pluck it out. So I'm going to leave you with these final 2 thoughts. When I was going on my faith journey to really understand faith, I came upon a quote, and it stayed with me. And there was lots of occurrences that really brought it forward. It's from the book of Esther. There's only 2 books in the whole Bible that are about women and being a feminist. I really wanted to find, tell me about the women. There's the book of Ruth, and then there's the book of Esther. And Esther is really interesting because, of course, she's beautiful and she's an orphan Jew. And I felt a lot of parallels of my own life to the story of Esther, although I didn't marry a king, although my husband is a king to me. I wanted to understand, well, what is really the point of this book? And in the book of Esther, there's a quote that says, she was born for such a time as this. And when I read that, it hit me that perhaps I was born for such a time as this, in this present moment, at this exact moment. And whenever I feel anxious or doubt, or I can see the ego monster coming into my life, I'm like, oh, I was born for such a time as this. And it just washes over me. And reading the book of Esther, I felt that there is many Esthers, that I'm not the only, that there are many of us that are born for such a time as this. And knowing that we are born for such a time as this, how are we using our life to heal? How are we using our life to bring love to others? How are we using our life to bring faith? How are we using our life to bring hope? I know that every person I meet now, this is my calling card. Every person I meet, I know they were born for such a time as this. I know they were. And when you take the map, you reach the gold. And when you go inward, it's there. So it's 1:03. We're going to come back to questions if anybody has any questions. But next week, we're going to talk about your beliefs and your blocks. Here is the book we're going to read for this week. So if you have a chance, please go check out Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. I loved this book. And I think it's very timely with everything that we're learning in the world today. I put my book up there. I know, I'm sorry, self-serving, but my book is a daily book. You read one a day, 1 page, 2 pages a day. So if you'd like to read it, it was my first one, not my best, but it's okay. I'm going to write another one called The Big P, but I'll get to that. And I want to leave you with this quote. Love the calling with passion. It is the meaning of your life. If you have pain, which I know you do, the calling is in the middle of that pain bucket. It's in you. It's in your bucket, inside of yourself. So grab the book. And if you really want to know more about our journey, you can actually check out our website here. Don't feel you need to. We're going to be here every Friday. Every Friday, we're going to walk through the 12 steps. If you would like to get your golden triangle done and get your whiteboard done and learn the math on that, you can head to that website. This course that I wrote, it's 30 years of my life, but I really say it's like 40. And if I'm really being honest, like 48, because I was born for such a time as this. And I know you were born for such a time as this. Thank you, thank you, thank you for joining us. This is a bit of the team that is involved with this wonderful company. And if you have a chance, join us next week for Finding Faith. Get Viktor Frankl this weekend in your own story. Look and see where your big P is. One little hot tip. If your big P was, say, 1985, that you think that that's where the wound began, I'd like you to watch movies from that big period. Yeah, 1985, if it's yours, from the date of your birth, between your date of your birth and your 10th birthday, somewhere in there is your big P. See if you can find your big P. Find your big P and live in that year. Eat the food, listen to the music, watch the movies. Just be and let your little person inside feel alive again. You've been pushing them down by the weight of that. Allow them to come in. My big P is 1981. And so with my big P at 1981, I have my playlist of 1981. And when I feel sad, when I feel lost, I put that playlist on. I watch the movies from 1981. So everyone has a big P. Discover your big P and there's going to be magic. So I'm going to leave it for those that once anybody has a question, I will be here. Christy's Canadian too. That's wonderful. If you have any questions, please come and visit us. ahahealing.online is our website. And I'm Janice Taylor, and thank you for joining us on Finding Faith Fridays. And I will see you next week. Mwah.